There were two main political groups that disputed power in the years after independence in Latin America, and they were conservatives and liberals. So let's begin here by discussing the principles of conservatism. And the image you see on the right, that is Lucas Alemán, who was a prominent conservative in the 1820s and 30s in post-independent Mexico. Conservatives were those politicians who wanted to retain many of the aspects of colonial society. They thought colonial society was ordered properly with the different hierarchies, and they wanted it to remain that way after independence. They defended tradition, and another key principle of their beliefs was they believed that Catholicism should remain the official religion of the state. So they did not seek a separation of church and state. Instead, just like it had been during the colonial period, Catholicism would be the official religion of these new countries. And they favored also a strong central government. And they wanted a strong central government because they believed it would take a strong executive at the head of the nation to be able to unite these different territories and to keep them from disintegrating into political chaos. And some of them even wanted monarchies at the head of the government. Not all of them, but many. They thought it would take a king at the head of the government to be able to unite these very diverse territories. And conservatives, they tended to come from the wealthy aristocratic families that resided in the national capitals and the largest cities of Latin America. And as their cultural influence, they looked back to Spain and Portugal, and they viewed their rivals, the liberals, as dangerous radicals who would turn society on its head. The liberals, in contrast to the conservatives, were much more forward-looking, and they emphasized progress and change in society. And the famous liberal you see here on the right, that was Benito Juarez. He was president of Mexico in the 1860s. Liberals sought to establish government of the people, the rule of law, and to guarantee individual civil liberties. And perhaps most importantly, the liberals wanted to separate church and state. They did not want Catholicism to be the official religion of the state. Instead, they believed in freedom of religion. They also called for the establishment of public schooling systems. And they believed this was important because they wanted to create modern citizens who would be loyal to these post-independent governments. And conservatives, on the other hand, believed that the Catholic Church should remain in charge of education, as it had been during the colonial period. So this issue of the church is really the big difference between liberals and conservatives. And we'll be reading about that this week, particularly in the Columbia Reader. Liberals also called for federal systems of government where power would reside not so much in the national government, but rather in the state and local municipal governments. So we could say they believed in states' rights, in other words, and more decentralized government. The theory behind this was that they believed if power is closer to the people, it's less likely to become corrupt. And whereas the conservatives looked to Spain and Portugal as their cultural influence, the liberals looked to Britain and France as their models to replicate. And the liberals also, they tended to come from more humble backgrounds than the conservatives. So they came from the smaller towns, and they weren't from aristocratic families. They were more seeking upward mobility. Now, both liberals and conservatives could be caudillos, and this is a term I want to define here because these caudillos dominated politics in the years of after independence. Caudillos were military and political leaders, and many of them had served the patriot cause in the wars of independence. They were often charismatic, wealthy landowners that controlled resources and enjoyed a personal following. Think of them as the strong man on horseback. They often stood above law and government institutions, and they came to power through force, not through elections. They would lead many of these revolts and civil conflicts during these years. And while most caudillos were similar to regional warlords, they dominated their home territories and their regions. Some of them became national figures, and some of the most famous caudillos I've listed here on the slide. First was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna of Mexico. That's who you see the image here on the right. Another was Tomas Mosquera of Colombia. We'll be reading a writing by him in the Columbia Reader this week. And others were Juan Manuel de Rosas of Argentina and Diego Portales of Chile. In the case of Santa Anna, which I know best, he actually started out as a liberal in the 1820s, but by the 1930s, he had become a conservative. And so that goes to show that caudillos were not so much concerned with ideology as they were with power. And we could say that the dominance of caudillos during this period was also another reason for political instability after independence. Because the most powerful of them, they had the authority and the influence to be able to lead these revolutions and to overthrow governments. So politics after independence in Latin America were quite chaotic. And generally speaking, from the 1820s to the 1840s, conservatives had held power. But after 1850, liberalism triumphed and came to dominate politics for the remainder of the century and beyond. And liberals were able to consolidate power after 1850 because the economies of Latin America began to recover after the destruction wrought by the wars of independence. The improving economic picture after 1850 meant more resources for these new governments, and this in turn translated into political stability. In addition, there were transformations in transportation technology and steam-powered ships, and soon after the railroad would revolutionize Latin American economies. And most importantly, after 1850, the mining economy began to recover. And there were also new export industries that boomed in the mid-19th century. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about one of the most important export industries of this period, and that was guano.